and how, oh wait, did we do contract monitoring yesterday, didn't we? No. Monitoring, and then we're talking about contract changes, when we have to make changes to the contract, how we go through that modification process. We'll talk about option years, because that's how the government adds an additional year to your contract. And then we'll talk about how you close out a contract. What I'll also do is there's a lot of detail around things like fraud and mistakes and delays and stuff like that. I'll have all that in EDGIT for you early next week, and then that way if those issues ever come up, you'll have those. Those are really like unique circumstances, so I wanted to make sure you got all the materials that you needed for actually running the contract. Okay, so as we mentioned, there's a difference between a core and a CO, and what's the difference?
The owner.
Well played. You were waiting for that moment. One actually has authority, the other one has sort of authority.
All right, so the core's responsibility comes from the CO, has to come through a delegation letter. Core can only do things that are in that delegation letter. And the core is primarily responsible for contract monitoring and contractor performance. So normally your closest relationship with anybody in the government will be with that core, because they'll be checking what you're doing on a daily basis. So, and they're also responsible for preparing the technical analysis of your performance. So they're actually the eyes and ears of the contracting officer on the day-to-day basis. So they're reporting up to them any kinds of issues or how you're doing just overall. Monitoring is successful if all potential problems are with any kind of performance or delivery requirements are reported directly to the CO, because the COR can't issue a cure notice or a delay or stop work order or anything like that. It has to go through the CO, so it's a reporting chain. Any non-compliance with other terms and conditions of the contract is identified and reported to the CO. So basically, the COR has the contract as their Bible, and they're watching what you do on a day-to-day basis and comparing you to that set of requirements. And anything where you're deviating from those requirements, that's what they're reporting to the CO. In order to do their job well, they have to document what they're seeing. So you'll see them, have reports, complete reports, and those are the things. The reports are good and bad. They just have to keep reporting what's happening in the contract. And that documentation is typically what saves the government when it comes to any kind of dispute. There's also technical analysis. Oftentimes, the CORs used to be called contracting officer technical representatives. And they were really the ones that had all the technical knowledge, or had a lot of the technical knowledge. Nowadays, they changed the word core, and I'm finding some cores really don't have any technical knowledge. So it's sort of a transition. So it's more of an administrative function to make sure that you're following the actual requirements. So they have to respond to any requests that you make of them. So if you don't understand something, you should talk to them. They're monitoring contract performance, and they're also, they resolve constructive changes. We'll talk about those in a bit. So when we say they have to respond to contractors, keep in mind that you're chugging along on your project schedule. And if you need to know something and they don't get back to you right away, now all of a sudden they've created a delay and it could potentially cause you to miss milestones. So it's really urgent on their part to make sure they get back to you with any answers to questions. They have, contractors can have a right to request government action. So, I sent you this deliverable. You were supposed to take 3 days to respond if there are any changes. It's now day 5. I haven't received anything. I'm requesting that you take action. It's also supposed to document the government responsibilities when the contractor makes a request. So if they're asking for information, the CO has to get back to them. COR has to get back to them. And then the impact from not complying with the request. So we had a discussion yesterday about government furnished property. And we said that if the government provides the property late or broken or whatever the other issues are, then again that can cause the contractor to have a delay, and that's something the COR needs to report. And they also have to report the impact of the fact that the government was delayed. So in this case, it may be a delay in the production cycle. The contractor has, the Corps has to document what our obligation is. So we have to submit our requests in writing, and they typically respond within a pre-established timeframe. So when you go to your kickoff meeting, they'll say, we'll respond to any request of yours within 24 hours or 32 hours, or 36 hours. You also need to notify government personnel other than the Corps when a request for a particular action is required. So sometimes questions are pretty basic. Who do I turn in this invoice to? Who do I get acceptance from? But other times it's like, well, there's two different valid solutions for how we can move forward. Which way do you want us to go? And the government, the Corps probably can't answer that question. They would need to go back to the program shop and get answers. So they're supposed to be the outreach back into the rest of the government to get answers to your question. And they also have to determine when they should just tell you to stop work, because either the contract's not going according to specification or there's some issues, so they can recommend to the contracting officer to issue you a stop work order. So they provide timely requests as separated by the contract, and they forward anything else to the contracting officer for their review. Monitoring is essential to ensure that all parties perform their respective obligations. So this is very different than the kind of business you typically do, right? Because you're a commercial business. Commercial business as a whole, and I'm being very generic here, tends to be much more loosey-goosey than federal contracting, right? Everything is so specified in our RFPs. You respond back with a proposal where you have to say you're going to do all these things unless you take exception. And, two business people could sit in a bar and put something on the back of the napkin and it could be a commercial deal, right? So it's this approach, they're trying to make sure that they do spend taxpayer dollars wisely, which is why all this monitoring occurs. And anytime there's any poor quality of work or deliverables, that could cause potential delays because now the contractor has to rework whatever they're doing, and it could impact the mission, right? So the government has this requirement because they're trying to fulfill the mission, and if you're late doing your part for this contract, they're not going to meet their mission. So what the Corps has to do is look at, across the contract, what specific functions need to be monitored. So obviously things like deliverables need to be monitored. Maybe ongoing daily performance on a certain task, or maybe a critical task. So they decide what functions have to be monitored, and then they select the techniques for monitoring. How is it that they're going to come in and look at what you're doing? Obviously, somebody looking over your shoulder isn't going to increase your productivity. But maybe they need to do interim checks with you to see how many transactions you processed today. And maybe you just fill out a report and you just submit it as you leave. And then that way they can do a monitoring just on transactions. They also have to determine how to document monitoring actions, how they have a file on you, and they'll document all these things and put them into that file. And then anything that's out of the ordinary or any kind of exception, we go up to the contracting officer. Routine monitoring examples. So, some basic stuff is they can just look to see that if you're producing a technical product, then it meets the technical specifications. Simple kind of monitoring. Or they could look at your schedule and figure out whether you're on schedule. Or they could look at the amount of dollars you spent and determine whether or not you're within the budget. So those are the kinds of things they can look at right off the bat. They can look at the financial condition of the contractor. So if you came in and they did a financial responsibility analysis on you, decided that you could handle government contracting, and now all of a sudden we're starting to see, we're filing for Chapter 11, that might be situations where they could go back and start monitoring you much more closely to see if their obligations are going to be met. Because if you go under and you can't perform the work, they have a risk of not meeting their mission. And then your statutory compliance. So, your contract is not just with the agency. Sometimes you have Department of Labor standards that you have to pay attention to. Sometimes you have NIST standards that you have to pay attention to. So they're verifying that you're compliant with those things as well. Cybersecurity, we had a big discussion last month when we were there. So there's a difference between monitoring in commercial contracts and non-commercial contracts. So if you're providing your commercial products or services, they assume you have your own internal quality assurance system and that they don't have to be doing all that monitoring with you. They also figure that there's customary market process that permits a buyer to have inspection. So let's say, for example, you're creating a customized vehicle. And for your commercial customers, you let them come in, as soon as the body is designed and as soon as the engine's designed or whatever the issues are, or the steps are. And your commercial customers are allowed to come in at those points and see it. In that case, then you need to let the government customers come in. So the government has to have the same monitoring and inspection that your normal commercial customers would have. But if you don't allow them to have any, then the government doesn't have any. If it's a non-commercial item, they have to identify any delinquencies, isolate the problem with the quality of the contractor work, so they actually have to tell the contractor that there's an issue. Support contractor requests for, okay, well, here was our interpretation of the requirement, tell us what your interpretation was so that they can get legally lines. Point out any need for government assistance, and then reveal the actual or anticipated default. So if the government thinks that you're only slightly off and it's just a matter of tweaking something, they'll let you continue on with the contract. But if they think you're violently off, right, they may say, we don't think you can get there, and you have to justify how you put it. Keep in mind too, you've got great contractors out there, lots of great contractors out there, and you've got some shady contractors out there. So if I am a shady contractor, if I'm a good contractor, I will have really analyzed the government requirements ahead of time. I would have made sure my system could handle their requirements. I would have put processes in place to be able to handle that, and I would have gone forward. And if there was something that there was a disconnect between the government and I, the deviation, I would say, let me figure out what I can do to fix it, or tell me what I misunderstood. Let's figure this out. But some shady contractors, if they didn't put enough time and effort, and they don't want to tell their boss they messed up or anything like that, they'll just try to act as if it's all the government's fault. So some contractors will actually try to place a lot more blame on the government, even though it's not their fault. It's strictly they didn't do a good job in their own accord. So I always try to balance, when I teach contracting officers and CORs, contractors are trying to make a profit, and if you come up with these deviations, it's going to eat into their profit, so they'll do everything to hold on to that profit, and they'll even to the point like that. Did you ever have situations like that where you knew it wasn't your fault, it was their fault that they were trying to win you?
Not always. That always happens, and everything's on proof. So one of the things is, just like you mentioned before, we document absolutely everything, every conversation, everything that's happening, and that's just to protect ourselves, and every business should do the same thing.
So the trend is to rely on the integrity of the contractors to deliver acceptable systems. I mean, keep in mind, as the government goes through, shrinkages and expansions, et cetera, they have a lot of work to do, and all this inspection stuff, there's a real question as to whether they should be doing it or you should be doing it. So, having your own internal systems to make sure you're compliant will help you be successful in government contracts. They can monitor you through site visits, coming to your location, testing items to be delivered, any kind of visual inspection of the work that you've done, or they can just look at reports that you've submitted to them. Keep in mind, any report that you submit to them has to be truthful. If it's not, you're committing fraud. So, this is not the time to, let me embellish this. I got 10 of these things done, but let's say I got 20 done, because that's what the project schedule says. That's fraud. You want to make sure you're honest in everything you're telling them. They can look at bar and milestone charts, per critical path methods to see whether or not you're according to schedule. How many people have heard of EVMS, Earned Value Management System? So this is a tool that came out of project management discipline. And basically, the government got tired of contractors saying, oh yeah, we're on schedule, we're on schedule, yeah, we're on schedule, we're on budget too, we're on schedule, we're on budget. And then they get closer to the end, and guess what? Not on schedule, not on budget. So they came up with this set of formulas to determine whether or not your project is producing the requisite amount of value at any point in time. So what do I mean by that? Let's say, for example, you have a year-long contract, and the contract started October 1st, because that's the government fiscal year, and it's now December 31st. How much of the work should you have gotten done by that point? Do I need to pour coffee for you?
When the next, yeah.
What? So if we're, how many, 3 months in, how much is that into a full schedule? Quarter, so how much of the work should have been done by that point? Quarter, right, and how much should we have charged by this point?
25%.
Good, and time-wise, we're at the 25% mark, right? So all those three things should be in sync. Now, obviously, there are some times where there's a lot of upfront work that needs to get done before, but the government should have a pretty good feel that unless there are extenuating circumstances, that we should be at the 25% mark across the board. If we're at the 50% cost mark, and we've only gotten 25% of the work done, there's trouble in River City, right? And so they need to, these metrics don't say, here's the particular problem. These metrics of burn bounty management just say there's a problem and requires the government contractor to figure out what's causing the problem, right? What's driven it. So that's another tool that we're using. And then we talked about cost monitoring. So individual cost monitoring, they're looking at categories of costs. So we talked before about there's direct cost and indirect. And so the direct are all the things like labor, material, anything that can be identified with a final cost objective, one objective, as opposed to an indirect or indirect cost, which is like overhead or G&A. And G&A and overhead sort of go across your entire company. So the government's going to look at your cost monitoring both at your rate level here, your indirect cost rate level, and they're going to look at your direct costs. And remember we talked about allowability, allocability, and reasonableness.
Could I add something real quick? This is kind of a little bit off topic, but one of the things, I don't know if you've covered it already, is the government requires that any materials or anything that is used for the contract has to be new, can't be used or surplus or anything like that. Everything has to be new. It's just for y'all's information. We can't accept it.
They can't be refurbished.
Right.
Yeah, good point. And you see that typically, you know, like you can buy an iPhone refurbished and it comes looking like new, but it's refurbished. How do they monitor your cost techniques? They look at your financial accounting system. They can come in and analyze your backup information for substantiation. They can do periodic analysis of the data obtained from the contractor, and they can do scheduled audits. Now keep in mind, this is done primarily in non-commercial item type contracts. Okay, here's our three big words: reasonable, allocable, and consistent with appropriate accounting standards, as well as allowable, right? Consistent with the allowability of certain costs. If expenses are considered too high, then contract funds may not be sufficient to complete the work. If expenses are too low, then performance may be falling behind schedule. So these are some of the indicators. Those are kind of the red lights that go off in the government's mind when they're looking at how you're progressing with the work. What documents do they use? They look at your cost proposal. Any reports required by the contract, like if you have to give periodic schedule updates, those would be reports that they could look at. Any contract terms, things like the award incentive fee provisions or labor hour contract provisions. And then they look at a prior acquisition history. So when they bought from you before, did you have issues? If you did, they're going to tend to want to monitor you more closely. They also do financial monitoring, where they're reading the Wall Street Journal, they're checking out things that are going on in business news that may be relevant to your company. So when we talked about the tsunami hitting Japan and it having a problem with chips for the computer, that would be something the government would come back and question you on. Are you still going to be able to meet the requirements of this contract? Remember war dogs? You know, how are you getting these Berettas to me? Oh, you can't run them through Italy. What, are you stupid? You didn't realize you couldn't run them through Italy? Italy's not sending directly. So it's those kind of things we're going to check up on. Did you watch War Dogs? 3 events have to take place. before a decision is made to monitor your performance, your financial condition. Some financial institutions